St. Saviour's Church in River Bend had never seen such flowers in February. White lilies and chrysanthemums brought from a neighboring town covered the altar and stood in tall vases along the aisle. For a small town where the last wedding was 3 years ago, this was quite an event. Heather Donovan stood in front of the mirror in the small bride's room. Her pale face with high cheekbones was framed by blonde hair gathered into a simple but elegant style. At 26, she already felt time slipping through her fingers. 7 years of working as a nurse in the town's only hospital had left her face with fine lines near her eyes. She'd seen enough death and suffering over the years to realize life was short and opportunities in River Bend were limited. This is my chance, Heather thought, smoothing out an inexpensive but still beautiful wedding dress she'd bought at a thrift store in a neighboring town. My chance to get out of here. The door creaked open, and her brother Vic peeked into the room. He looked older in his 30s. Hard work as a cab driver and an addiction to cheap whiskey had left their marks. His perpetually wrinkled jacket had been replaced today by a rented suit that fit him like a hanger. "Everyone's ready," he said, not hiding the disapproval in his voice. "Your fiancé is waiting." Heather caught his gaze in the mirror. "Listen, Vic, I know what you're thinking, but Ray is a good man. He cares about me." "Of course he does," Vic grinned crookedly. "Especially about your young body. Heath, he's 50 years old, half a century. When you went to first grade, he was already opening his second store." Heather sighed. This was a discussion they'd had many times over the past 6 months, ever since Ray Lewis, owner of 3 small grocery stores, had proposed to her. He was practically a tycoon for River Bend, the only person who could afford a new car every 3 years. "It's my choice, Vic, and you could at least support me today." Vic ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he always did when he was nervous. "You know I just want you to be happy, don't you? And to have someone to borrow money from for another debt," Heather thought bitterly, but kept silent. Vic had been her only family since their parents had died in a car accident 10 years ago. "Let's go," she took him under her arm. "Let's not keep the groom waiting." Ray Lewis stood at the altar, straight as a stick, wearing a dark gray tailored suit. His graying temples and deep wrinkles around his eyes made him look like an austere but respectable businessman. He smiled as Heather entered the church on her brother's arm. The smile didn't touch his eyes. They remained cold and calculating, taking note of every detail, just like in his stores, where he always knew if one of the staff ate a candy bar off the shelf. In the front row sat Luis Garcia, Ray's store manager, a short man with running eyes and perpetually sweaty palms. He kept checking his cell phone, as if he were waiting for an important message. Susan Norton, Heather's colleague from the hospital, sat next to him. Her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style, and her dress, too daring for church, emphasized her figure. She looked at Ray with a look that no one in the audience could fail to notice. The ceremony was short. The invitees were few. River Bend was the kind of place where people had few friends but plenty of acquaintances who knew everything about you. After limiting themselves to vows and the exchange of rings, the newlyweds soon left the church to the applause of the few guests. The celebration was held at the only restaurant in town, the Blue Pine, owned by the mayor's cousin. 3 long tables, decorated with white tablecloths in the same colors as in the church, accommodated all the guests. Ray must have been generous with the food. The tables were bursting with dishes. Heather sat next to her husband, uncomfortable under the stares. She knew what the guests were talking about: the age difference, the fact that Ray had been widowed only 3 years ago. In a small town, everyone knew too much about each other. Susan, sitting 2 tables over, kept her eyes on Ray. Several times she accidentally found herself next to him, touching his arm or shoulder. Heather knew about their past relationship. Susan had once let slip after a shift and a couple glasses of wine. "Nothing serious," she'd said then, "just fun." Luis kept a continuous eye on service, as if this were one of Ray's stores and not a restaurant. Of Mexican descent, he had moved to River Bend 10 years ago and had served Ray faithfully ever since. Luis was said to know more about Lewis's finances than anyone else, including the IRS. Vic drank more than he should have. He sat in a far corner with a few of his friends, and every toast was accompanied by a complete emptying of his glass. By the middle of the evening, His eyes had turned red, and his movements became unsteady. By 9 o'clock in the evening, Heather felt very tired. The tension of the past weeks, the sleepless nights before the wedding, and the constant smiling for the guests had exhausted her. She leaned over to Ray and whispered, "I think I'll go home." Tired. Ray looked at her carefully. "Of course, darling. Take my keys. I'll be a while. I need to make sure everyone's happy and pay off the restaurant." He kissed her cheek, and his lips seemed cold to Heather. Deep down, she knew that marriage was a bargain. She was getting financial stability and a chance at a better life, and he was getting a young wife who would take care of him in his old age. Love? Perhaps it would come with time. On the way out of the restaurant, Heather bumped into Susan. She was shaken up, having had too much to drink. "Congratulations," Susan said, hugging Heather a little too tightly. "You're Mrs. Lewis now. How does that sound?" Heather pulled away, smelling the wine from her friend. "Thank you, Susan. I have to go now." Sure, Susan winked. "First wedding night. You know, Ray has his, peculiarities, but you probably already know that." Heather flared with embarrassment and anger but held back. "Good night, Susan." Ray's house, now their shared home, stood on the outskirts of River Bend. It wasn't a mansion, but a solid 2-story house, with a well-kept, though now snow-covered garden. Heather knew Ray was proud of the house. It had been built to his own design 15 years ago. Parking the car, Heather sat for a while, staring at the dark windows. A strange sense of the wrongness of what was happening swept over her, but she pushed it away. Just nerves, she thought. The house was quiet and dark. Heather turned on the light and went up to the bedroom, their shared bedroom from today. She changed into a silk nightgown, the only expensive thing she had allowed herself to buy for the wedding. Sitting down in front of the mirror, she began to brush her hair. The mirror reflected the bed and the window overlooking the garden. The wedding dress hung on a rack in the corner of the room, a white blur in the semi-darkness. Heather thought of Ray, of his cold eyes, of the way he had looked at her during the ceremony. Not like a man in love, but like a man who had purchased an expensive item. Suddenly she heard a sound, the creak of a floorboard on the stairs. Her heart beat faster. "Is Ray back early?" she thought anxiously. Glancing at her watch, she saw that it had only been half an hour since she had arrived. "Ray?" She called out, but there was no answer. The creaking repeated, now closer to the bedroom door. Heather stood up, fumbling nervously with the hairbrush in her hands. The door slowly opened. Ray Lewis stopped the car in front of the house at 12:30 at night. The evening had dragged on longer than he had planned. The conversation with Vic was more difficult than he had anticipated. Heather's brother was drunk and aggressive, accusing Ray of buying his sister. Ray had to do his best not to lose his patience. "I did it for Heather," he thought as he pulled out his keys. "Now we have to try to make things work with her brother." The house was quiet. The only lights on were in the hallway and on the stairs. Heather must have gone to bed. Ray went upstairs, careful not to wake his wife. The door to the bedroom was ajar. He entered quietly and saw a silhouette on the bed. "Heather?" he called out in a whisper, but there was no answer. Ray turned on the light. A scream caught in his throat. Heather was lying on the bed, but no longer his young wife, but a lifeless doll with glassy eyes. Her silk nightgown, once white, was now soaked with blood from a deep wound in her chest, apparently caused by a sharp object. On the bedside table lay a bloody letter opener, Ray's engagement gift. Heather's arms were spread limply, as if in a dream, but it was a dream from which there was no awakening. Ray collapsed to his knees by the bedside, unable to believe his eyes. His whole measured, planned life had turned into a nightmare in an instant. With trembling hands, he pulled out his cell phone and dialed a number. "Sheriff Morrison?" His voice sounded like a stranger. "Get here as soon as you can. My wife is dead." Sheriff Clyde Morrison pulled up in front of Ray Lewis's house at 1:12 in the morning. The old police Ford squealed its brakes on the icy driveway. Falling snow had already begun to cover the tire tracks, and Morrison figured that by morning nature would erase any evidence left outside. The house was lit up like a Christmas tree. Lights were on in almost every window. Several police cars and an ambulance were crowded around the entrance, though it was obvious that the victim no longer needed medical attention. Morrison had been the sheriff of Riverbend for nearly 15 years. In that time, only 3 murders had occurred in their small town, 2 in drunken brawls and 1 due to jealousy. But the murder of a bride on her wedding day that hadn't even made the crime reports of neighboring towns. He got out of the car, adjusted his holster, and pulled on his uniform jacket. Morrison, 44 years old, was still trim from his army training. A scar crossed his left cheek, a memory of his service in a hot spot. That scar, as well as his habit of looking the other person straight in the eye, made many of the town's residents uncomfortable in his presence. He was met at the door by Officer Parker, a young police officer, visibly pale even in the dim lantern light. "Sheriff, the body is upstairs. Dr. Collins is already examining it. The husband, he's in the living room. He looks shaken up." Morrison nodded. "Who else is in the house?" "The victim's brother arrived 10 minutes ago. He's in the kitchen. We've called a couple more witnesses from the wedding for questioning." "Uh-huh. Okay. I'm gonna go check out the crime scene first." As Morrison walked up the stairs, he could smell the perfume mixed with the metallic tang of blood that was unmistakable. The Lewis's bedroom was spacious, with a large bed in the middle. Dr. Collins, the elderly coroner, leaned over the body of a young woman. "Good evening, Sheriff," he said, keeping his eyes on his work. "Not a good evening, though." "What can you tell me, Doc?" Collins straightened with a quiet grunt. His glasses gleamed in the light of the lamps. "Stab wound to the chest area. Looks like the knife pierced the heart. Death was instantaneous. The time was sometime between 10 o'clock and 11 p.m. I'll be more specific after the autopsy." Morrison looked around the room. On the bedside table was a letter opener, a fine piece with an inlaid handle, now stained with blood. Next to the bed was a broken lamp and an overturned chair, clear signs of a struggle. One of the windows was shattered, splinters dotting the floor, and there were traces of blood on the curtain. "Strange," the sheriff muttered, pointing to the window. "The glass is inside the room, so the blow had come from outside." "Maybe the killer threw something through the window," suggested Parker, standing in the doorway. "Or a distraction," Morrison said thoughtfully. "Check the area under the window as soon as it's light." The snow had probably covered it all up by now, though. He walked over to the dressing table where Heather's hairbrush and cosmetics lay. The drawer was pulled out, the contents in disarray. "Someone was looking for something," he observed, "or wanted to make it look like a robbery." In the dresser, Morrison noticed a woman's purse among the neatly stacked items. He opened it carefully and began to go through the contents: wallet, keys, lipstick, cell phone, and a small piece of paper. The sheriff unfolded it. It was a receipt from the Pine Grove Motel in nearby Greenfield, dated last Monday. Strange that a girl would keep such a small thing. "Officer Parker, make sure all the items are thoroughly described, especially jewelry and valuables." As he left the room, Morrison noticed something shiny on the floor near the door. Bending over, he picked up a dainty silver bracelet with a key pendant. It didn't look like a piece of jewelry from a cheap store, too fine a workmanship. "It's not mine," came a voice from the doorway. Ray Lewis stood there, pale as a sheet. "Heather didn't have a bracelet like that." Morrison looked at the man carefully. "Mr. Lewis, you shouldn't be here. I'll come down and talk to you in a minute." The living room was warm from the crackling fireplace. Ray Lewis sat in a chair, hunched over and wrapped his arms around his head. His wedding suit was wrinkled and his shirt was stained with blood from touching his wife's body. "Mr. Lewis," Morrison began, taking a seat across from him, "I need to ask you a few questions." Ray raised his head. His eyes were red but dry. "Sure, I want you to find whoever did this. Tell me what happened tonight." Ray took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "After the ceremony, we went to the Blue Pine for the banquet. Heather was tired and left for home at about 9 in the evening. I gave her the car keys and told her I'd be late." "Why'd you stay late?" "I wanted to talk to Vic, Heather's brother. He was against our marriage because of our age difference. I thought that now that Heather and I were married, we could work things out." "And how did the conversation go?" Ray wrinkled his nose. "Not great. Vic was drunk. Said I'd bought his sister, that she'd only married me for the money. We almost had a fight. Did anybody hear you two talking? I think a lot of people did. We were in the restaurant, though we were off to the side. Morrison made a note in his notebook. What time did you get home? About 12:30. I went straight upstairs and... His voice trembled. I found her. Did you notice anything unusual? Any signs of forced entry? Any extraneous noises? Ray shook his head. Nothing. The door was locked. I figured Heather was asleep by now. Who has keys to your house? Just me and now Heather. Oh, and there's a spare set in my office at the store, just in case. Who has access to your office? Ray's been thinking. Luis Garcia, my manager. But he would never... We're just gathering information, Mr. Lewis. Morrison interrupted him. What can you tell us about this bracelet? He showed the jewelry he'd found. Ray shook his head. I've never seen it before. It wasn't a gift from me, and I'm sure Heather didn't have it. Okay, one more question. Have you noticed anything strange in Heather's behavior lately? Ray frowned. I don't. Maybe she's been a little tense, but I chalked it up to pre-wedding worries. Or doubt, Morrison thought, but didn't say it out loud. Vic Donovan sat at the kitchen table, twirling a cup of long cold coffee. He still smelled of alcohol, but his eyes were clear. The news of his sister's death seemed to have sobered him instantly. Mr. Donovan, Morrison began, please accept my condolences. Vic raised his inflamed eyes to him. It was my fault. I should have gotten her out of that house before it was too late. Why do you say that? Vic grinned bitterly. Because he knew nothing good could come of this marriage. Heather didn't marry him for love. She wanted to get out of that hole, thought Ray was her ticket to a better life. Did you disapprove of their relationship? Of course not. He's 50, she's 26. What kind of love can there be? It's a bargain, his money in exchange for her youth. Morrison made another note in his notebook. Tell me about your conversation with Mr. Lewis this evening. Vic lowered his eyes. I said some things to him. Drunk. Said he was an old asshole who bought my sister, that she deserved better. Did you threaten him? Maybe. I don't remember exactly. I was very angry. Where did you go after the wedding? Vic hesitated to answer. Home. One of my friends gave me a ride. Can you tell me his name? Ted Baker. He dropped me off at my house about 10 o'clock. I had another beer and fell asleep on the couch. Then I was awakened by your call. Can anyone confirm that you were home after 10? Vic shook his head negatively. I live alone. Of course you do, Morrison thought. The perfect alibi for murder. Susan Norton arrived at the Lewis house a half hour after the call. Her dark hair was disheveled and her hastily worn pajamas were visible from under her coat. She looked confused, but Morrison saw a strange gleam in her eyes, either fear or excitement. Miss Norton, thank you for coming so late. Susan sat on the edge of the living room couch, nervously rubbing the strap of her purse. It's awful, Sheriff. I still can't believe it. Heather was so... alive. Were you two close? Susan nodded. We worked together at the hospital. Sometimes we'd have a drink after a shift. Did she ever talk about problems? Maybe afraid of someone? No. I mean... Susan hesitated. She was worried about the wedding, of course. It's a big step. Just because of the wedding? Susan looked away. I don't know what you mean. I heard you had a relationship with Mr. Lewis before. Susan's cheeks flared. Who told you that? It wasn't a relationship, just a few meetings. It ended long before he started dating Heather. And you weren't upset when they announced the wedding? Of course not. Her voice sounded too loud. I only wished Heather happiness. Where were you between 10 and 11 p.m.? At home. After the banquet, I went straight home, took a bath, drank some wine, and went to bed. Can anyone confirm that? Susan's tense. No, I live alone. Morrison noticed that she was nervously clenching and unclenching her fists. There was a red mark on her wrist, as if from a tight bracelet. Does this bracelet look familiar to you? He asked, showing the silver piece of jewelry. Susan's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly pulled herself together. No, I've never seen it before. A lie, Morrison thought. That bracelet got her a reaction. Luis Garcia was the last to arrive, around 3 in the morning. A short Mexican man in an impeccable suit with a perfectly tied tie despite the time of day. His eyes were constantly running around the room, as if he were searching for hidden threats. "Mr. Garcia, how long have you worked for Mr. Lewis?" 10 years, Luis answered with a slight accent. "I came to his first store as a longshoreman. Ray noticed my aptitude for numbers and made me bookkeeper and then manager. Do you have access to his private office?" Louis nodded warily. "Yes, I handle all the paperwork. And the company's finances?" "Of course. We're a small business, we don't need a separate CFO." "How are Mr. Lewis's stores doing?" Louis gave a little wince. "Business is business. Ups and downs, but we're doing okay. More ups or downs lately." "Sheriff, I don't see what this has to do with Mrs. Lewis's death." Morrison gave him a hard look. "I'm asking the questions, Mr. Garcia. You answer them. That's how an investigation works. So?" Luis sighed. "The last year has been, challenging. A new supermarket opened 10 miles from here. A lot of customers go there now." "Is Mr. Lewis in financial trouble?" No, Luis answered too quickly. "It's just that profits are down. Where were you between 10 and 11 o'clock at night?" "I left right after the banquet. Ray asked me to stop by the general store and check the safe. We had a big sale before the weekend." "Did anyone see you there?" "I don't think so. It was late evening. The store was already closed." Morrison nodded. Another alibi that couldn't be verified. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the snow-covered yard, Morrison again surveyed the crime scene. Officers combed the area around the house and found distinct footprints in the snow under the broken bedroom window. Someone had definitely been there last night. Morrison stood at the bedroom window, pondering the evidence. The broken window, the silver bracelet, the motel receipt, all suspects with no alibis. Everyone's motives are different. Jealousy, money, resentment, secrets, classic detective puzzle. He looked at the bed where only a few hours ago lay the body of the young woman whose life had been cut short so suddenly. "What was going on here last night, Heather?" he mentally asked. And as if in answer to his question, a picture of the last minutes of Heather Donovan Lewis's life began to take shape in his mind. Heather sat in front of the mirror in her silk nightgown, brushing her hair. The day had been long and tedious. The wedding, the congratulations, the fake smiles, it had all exhausted her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Mrs. Lewis. It sounded strange, but it would take some getting used to. After all, it was her choice to marry a man she respected but didn't love. A choice in favor of stability and comfort over an uncertain future. Suddenly, she heard a noise downstairs. Someone had entered the house. "Is Ray back early?" she thought anxiously. She wasn't ready for their first wedding night, physically or mentally. Footsteps on the stairs, quiet, cautious. Heather froze with a hairbrush in her hand. "Ray?" she called out, but there was no answer. The door to the bedroom slowly opened. A familiar silhouette stood on the threshold. "It's you," Heather exhaled with relief. "Why are you here?" "We need to talk," the voice answered, and the figure stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The face of the person he was talking to was tense, eyes glittering with a strange, feverish gleam. "What's wrong?" Heather asked, feeling a growing uneasiness. "You shouldn't have married him. It's a mistake." "We've already discussed this. It's my choice." "Choice?" The voice was getting louder. "What choice? To sell yourself for the promise of a comfortable life?" Heather stood up, the hairbrush falling out of her hand. "Walk away. Now is not the time for this conversation. When will it be? When you're finally owned by him." Heather backed away. "You're acting weird. What's wrong with you?" "Me? What's wrong with you? You're not the Heather I knew." The conversation was turning into an argument. Voices were rising. Heather tried to go to the door, but the way was blocked. "Let me through. You're not going anywhere until you hear me out." She pushed her companion away, but he grabbed her arm. In the ensuing struggle, a chair toppled, a lamp shattered. "Let go, you're hurting me." If only you'd listen. If only you'd understand. His hand reached for the bedside table, fumbled for a letter opener. "Get out, I'll scream. No one will hear." The movement was lightning fast, desperate, unexpected. The blade entered Heather's chest. Her eyes widened with shock and pain. "What are you—" she wheezed, slumping to the floor. The killer looked at his bloody hands with horror, realizing what he had done. In panic, he rushed to the window, smashed it with his bare hands, and threw something out. Blood dripped onto the windowsill, onto the floor, onto the white snow below. The last thing Heather saw before the darkness swallowed her was a familiar face contorted with fear and regret. Sheriff Clyde Morrison sat in his office, looking at the board where he had placed the photos of everyone involved in the case. Brightly colored threads connected the faces, creating a web of relationships and suspicion. In the center hung a picture of Heather, a smiling young woman in a nurse's uniform, unaware that 6 months later, her life would be cut short on her own wedding day. Outside the window, snow was falling, covering the town in a white shroud as if trying to hide all its secrets. It had been 3 days since the murder, but Morrison felt that the answer was somewhere close at hand. All he had to do was connect the threads correctly. He went over the statements, going back over and over again to the details. There was something suspicious about each of the suspects, but no one looked like a definite killer. Ray Lewis was a widower who'd married a woman half his age. Outwardly, a calm and sensible businessman. But what lurks behind that mask? Morrison checked his alibi. Several guests confirmed that they had seen him in the restaurant before 11 o'clock at night. That didn't rule him out completely, but it made it unlikely that he was directly involved in the murder. Vic Donovan, the victim's brother with a drinking problem and, as it turned out, a gambling addiction. His friend confirmed that he dropped him off at his house around 10, but beyond that, no one could guarantee that Vic stayed there. And from his house to the Lewis residence is only 15 minutes by car. Susan Norton is Heather's co-worker and friend, Ray's ex-lover. Her testimony about where she was tonight, no one could corroborate. And that silver bracelet found at the crime scene. Morrison was sure Susan had lied when she said she'd never seen it. And finally, Luis Garcia, Ray's loyal assistant who knew all of his secrets. He seemed to have no motive, but what if he knew something the others didn't? Morrison rubbed his eyes. 4 suspects, 4 possible motives, and no conclusive evidence. He opened the case file again, reviewing the medical examiner's report. Dr. Collins confirmed that death occurred between 10 and 11 p.m. from a single stab to the heart. The victim's body showed signs of a struggle, bruises on the wrists, a broken fingernail. Among the physical evidence were a motel receipt, a silver bracelet, and a bloody letter opener. Morrison picked up the clear bag containing the bracelet. A thin silver chain with a key pendant. Symbolic. A clue? A phone call interrupted his musings. "Sheriff, it's Parker. We checked the Pine Grove Motel in Greenfield. Heather Donovan was indeed there last Monday. Checked in under her own name, but not alone." Morrison straightened up in his chair. "Who was she with?" "That's where it gets interesting." The desk clerk described a middle-aged, dark-haired man with a beard. "Sounds like Luis Garcia. They got a room for 2 hours." Morrison frowned. Luis and Heather. That was unexpected. "There's something else," Parker continued. "We looked into Vic Donovan's finances. He had debts at Greenfield's underground casino, about $15,000. But 2 days ago, he suddenly paid it off in cash. One day after his sister died," Morrison said thoughtfully. "Check all of Heather's accounts. Maybe she had savings that could have gone to her brother. Already did. Nothing significant. Just a regular nurse's account. Paycheck comes in, goes to rent and expenses. No large sums. So the money came from another source. Thanks, Parker." Morrison hung up the phone and went back to the board. Now he had new strings to pull. Lewis and Heather at the motel. Vic suddenly paying off his debts. And that silver bracelet. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of a jewelry store in Greenfield, showing a picture of the bracelet to the owner. After a brief conversation, his suspicions were confirmed. Ray had indeed purchased this bracelet for Susan Norton 6 months ago. The salesman remembered it well, because Lewis took a long time to choose and insisted on the engraving on the back of the pendant. "Can you read the engraving?" Morrison asked. "Sure," replied the salesman. It was a short message. "Forever yours, R." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Ray had given Susan the romantically engraved bracelet 6 months ago, just as he'd started dating Heather. It didn't fit the story of a long overdue relationship. Morrison decided it was time for a more serious conversation with Susan Norton. Susan looked tense as Officer Parker led her into the sheriff's office. Her gaze darted to the picture board, lingering on the image of the silver bracelet that now lay on the desk in front of Morrison. "Have a seat, Miss Norton," the sheriff said, pointing to a chair. Susan sat down, licking her lips nervously. "I've already told you everything." "Not quite everything." Morrison slid the bracelet toward her. "You said you'd never seen this bracelet, but that's a lie. It's yours, isn't it?" Susan stared at the jewelry like a rabbit at a boa constrictor. "Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about." "It's engraved on the back of the pendant. Forever yours, R. Ray gave you this bracelet 6 months ago when he was already dating Heather. Your relationship with him wasn't over as you claimed." Susan lowered her head. Her shoulders shook. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Tell me what it is." Susan took a deep breath. "Yes, Ray and I have been seeing each other. It started about a year ago. A casual flirtation that turned into something more. He told me he loved me, that we'd be together. Gave me gifts, promised me a future. And then Heather showed up?" Susan nodded, grinning bitterly. He'd seen her in the hospital when he'd had his checkup, young, beautiful, and naive, the perfect wife for a respectable businessman. He started courting her, but he told me it meant nothing, that he needed to maintain a certain image in the city, and I would be his true love. And you believe that? And I wanted to believe. He was so convincing, gave me that damn bracelet and said he'd always be mine. And then a month later, he announced his engagement to Heather. Morrison looked at her closely. "You were furious." "Of course I was." Her voice shook. "He was using me. I thought we were building a relationship, and to him it was just entertainment." "Did you threaten him?" "Maybe." Susan lowered her eyes. "I told him I'd tell Heather everything. He begged me to keep quiet, said it would ruin his reputation." "And you agreed to keep quiet?" "Yes." She looked up at the sheriff with tears in her eyes. "But not because of his pleas, because of Heather. She was my friend. I didn't want to hurt her." "Where were you the night of the murder, Miss Norton? And the truth this time?" Susan sighed as if giving up. "I drove to Ray's house. I wanted to talk to Heather, to tell her the truth. Even if it was too late, she deserved to know who she married." "So you went into the house?" Susan nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. The door was unlocked. I went upstairs to the bedroom. I saw her. Heather was lying on the bed, covered in blood. I panicked. I couldn't believe my eyes. I tried to feel for a pulse, but she was already dead. "Did you call the police?" "No," Susan whispered. "I was scared. I thought I'd be blamed. I had a motive, jealousy, resentment. I ran out of the house and drove away, and lost the bracelet." Susan looked at her wrist, as if only now realizing that the bracelet wasn't there. "The clasp must have opened when I was leaning over Heather. I hadn't even noticed." Morrison scrutinized her face. The story sounded plausible, but something about it still didn't add up. "Why didn't you tell it right away?" "I was afraid," Susan answered simply. "Afraid that no one would believe that I didn't kill her, that they'd think the jealous ex was out for revenge." Morrison nodded. That made sense. But there was something else. "Did you see anyone outside the house? A car, maybe?" Susan hesitated for a moment. "Yeah, I think so. An old sedan, like the one Vic drives. I saw it when I drove up, but I didn't pay much attention. Another piece of the puzzle has taken its place." Vic Donovan looked exhausted, with red eyes and a 3-day stubble when he was brought into the sheriff's office. "You lied to me, Mr. Donovan," Morrison began without preamble. "You had debts at the Greenfield Casino, $15,000, and the day after your sister died, you suddenly paid it off in cash. Where'd the money come from?" Vic flinched as if he'd been hit. "I didn't kill Heather," he said hoarsely. "She was the only person I had left." "Where'd the money come from, Vic?" He lowered his head. "Ray. He gave it to me the morning after Heather died. Said it was for the funeral and to keep me afloat." "And you used it to pay off your debts? What was I supposed to do?" Vic snapped at me. "Those men threatened to break my legs." "Did Heather know about your debts?" Vic nodded. "She did. I asked her to help, to borrow money. She refused. Said she wouldn't encourage my addiction, that I should work out my own problems." "And you got angry." Of course I got mad! Vic pounded his fist on the table. But not mad enough to kill her. I loved my sister. She was stubborn, sometimes tough, but she always took care of me. Morrison stared at him in silence. Vic looked sincere, but the rage he displayed spoke volumes. A man like that in desperation could do anything. Did you drive to Ray's house that evening? Vic froze. No, why would you say that? Your car was seen there. Susan Norton recognized it. Vic went pale. Yeah, he stammered. Oh, shit. Okay. I did go down there. I wanted to talk to Heather again, convince her that Ray wasn't who he said he was. But when I got to the house, I saw another car there, so I decided not to get involved. I figured Ray was home early, so I left. What time was that? About 10 o'clock. Maybe a little later, just about the time of the murder. Morrison made a note in his notebook. What about the Pine Grove Motel? He asked out of the blue. Did you know your sister was meeting Luis Garcia there? Vic's eyes widened in surprise. What? Heather and that Mexican accountant? That doesn't make any sense. The reaction seemed genuine. If Vic was lying, he was doing it very convincingly. Luis Garcia sat up straight with his hands on his knees. His face was impenetrable, but his eyes betrayed nervousness. Mr. Garcia, Morrison began, I know you met Heather Donovan at the Pine Grove Motel the week before her wedding. Would you like to explain? Louis turned slightly pale, but kept his composure. It's not what you think, Sheriff. Enlighten me. Louis sighed. Heather found out something about Ray's financial situation. She wanted to talk about it in a place where no one would see us. And what did she find out? Louis paused, as if weighing the pros and cons. Ray's business isn't going as well as he shows. His stores have been losing money for the last 2 years. He mortgaged his house to cover his debts. Heather somehow found out about it and was furious. Said he had cheated her, that she was only marrying him because of the stability he supposedly had to offer. And what did you tell her? The truth. That Ray is a good man who's just proud. That he really loves her and hopes things will get better soon. I asked her not to cancel the wedding, not to embarrass him in front of the whole town. And she agreed? Louis shrugged. I don't know. She said she'd think about it. I never saw her again until after the wedding. Morrison made a note in his notebook. Did Ray know about this meeting? No. Heather called me directly. I didn't want to worry my boss before the wedding. What about Susan Norton? Did you know about her relationship with Ray? Louis pressed his lips together. The whole office knew. Ray wasn't exactly secretive about it. Invited her into his office, gave her gifts. Then Heather showed up and everything changed. How did Susan react? How do you think she reacted? Hysterical, jealous. She came to the office, demanded an explanation. Ray was afraid she'd tell Heather everything. But she didn't? Apparently not, Louis shrugged. The wedding had taken place. Morrison watched Louis's reaction carefully. Something about his demeanor seemed unnatural, as if he were playing the part of a loyal servant, but there was something else behind that mask. Where were you the evening of the wedding day, Mr. Garcia? I already told you. I left right after the banquet. Ray asked me to check the safe in the general store. And you were there the whole time? Yeah, until midnight. Counting cash, reconciling reports. Can anyone confirm that? No. It was late at night, store was closed. Morrison nodded. Another alibi that can't be verified. Do you have keys to Ray's house? Louis tensed slightly. No, I mean, not exactly. There's a spare set kept in Ray's office in case he loses his, but I've never used it. But you had access to those keys? Technically, yes. They're in the desk drawer. Morrison made another note. Another suspect with opportunity and motive. The last one of the day was Ray Lewis. He looked 10 years older, with deep shadows under his eyes and a gaunt face. Thank you for coming, Mr. Lewis, Morrison began. I have some new questions. Ray nodded, staring blankly at the sheriff. Do you recognize this bracelet? Morrison placed the silver piece of jewelry in front of him. Ray's eyes widened for a moment. Yes. I was buying it, a gift. For Susan Norton, 6 months ago when you were already dating Heather. Ray lowered his head. It was a mistake. I wanted to end things with Susan gently, without scandal. By giving her a bracelet engraved, "Forever Yours"? I wasn't thinking, Ray muttered. It was stupid. Mr. Lewis, I'm aware of your financial situation. You've been hiding from Heather that your business is on the verge of bankruptcy, that the house was mortgaged. Ray flinched. Who told you that? Mr. Lewis? Does it matter? What matters is that you deceived Heather. She married you, counting on financial stability that you didn't have. I wanted to make things right, Ray said quietly. I planned to sell the store, pay off my debts. Things would get better. Heather found out the truth a week before the wedding. She was furious. Ray looked up. Who told you? I didn't know she knew. She met Lewis at the Pine Grove Motel. He confirmed your financial situation. Ray turned pale. Heather and Louis? Are you sure? The desk clerk recognized them both. They took a room for 2 hours. Ray covered his face with his hands. Oh my God, I didn't know. I thought she'd gotten it from someone at the bank, or from Susan. Morrison watched his reaction carefully. The shock looked genuine. If Ray didn't know about his wife's meeting with his manager, it could change the whole picture. Mr. Lewis, where was the spare set of keys to your house? You said it was kept in your office. Yes, in the top drawer of my desk, under the papers. Who had access to your office? Only Lewis, and the cleaning lady, but she comes in during the day when everyone's at work. Morrison nodded. Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I have one more question. Vic Donovan said you gave him $15,000 the day after Heather died. Is that true? Ray nodded. Yes, he was in a terrible state. Said he was in trouble with some people in Greenfield. I thought, he's Heather's only relative. I had to help. Despite your own financial difficulties, I had some savings. Not much, but enough to help him. Morrison tapped his pencil on the desk thoughtfully. Talking to each suspect only made the picture more complicated. But gradually the truth was beginning to emerge through the web of lies and innuendo. The next day, Morrison gathered all the suspects in his office. Ray, Vic, Susan, and Louis sat side by side, avoiding looking at each other. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Thank you all for coming, Morrison began. I've encountered a lot of conflicting testimony in the course of this investigation. Some of you are lying, perhaps all of you. He walked in front of them, looking each one in the eye. Heather Donovan was a young woman who dreamed of a better life. She thought she had found a way out in marriage to a wealthy man. Little did she know her fiancé was on the verge of bankruptcy. Ray lowered his head. A week before the wedding, she found out the truth and was furious. Met Luis Garcia at a motel to confirm her suspicions. Luis nervously adjusted his tie. But Heather decided not to call off the wedding. Maybe because it was too late. Maybe because she was still hoping for the best. Or maybe she had another plan. Morrison turned to Susan. Miss Norton, you were Ray's mistress. He promised you a future, and then he left you for Heather. You felt betrayed. You wanted revenge. The night of the murder, you drove to the Lewis house, ostensibly to tell Heather the truth. Susan clasped her hands in her lap. And you, Mr. Donovan, Morrison continued, turning to Vic, were desperate about the debts. Your sister refused to help. You saw her marriage to a wealthy man as a chance to solve your problems. You drove up to the Lewis's house that night too, but when you saw the other car, you drove away. Vic nodded without looking up. All of you had a motive, Morrison said, and each of you had opportunity. But only one man was at the Lewis house between 10 and 11 o'clock at night. Only one person had a confrontation with Heather that escalated into violence. He paused, looking at the tense faces. I haven't told you about one important detail. The knife used to kill Heather had traces of the killer's blood on it, in addition to her blood. He cut himself during the attack, and that blood allowed us to pinpoint who was in the bedroom at the time of the murder. It was a bluff. The DNA analysis hadn't been completed yet. But Morrison was watching the suspect's reactions closely, and the reaction was almost immediate. Lewis jumped up, knocking over a chair. It was an accident, he shouted. I didn't mean to kill her. Everyone in the room froze. Morrison nodded slowly to Officer Parker, who stepped forward with the handcuffs. Luis Garcia, you are under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Heather Donovan Lewis. Later, after Luis was led away, Morrison recorded his confession. The story was surprising but logical. Louis had been in love with Ray for years. Secretly, unrequited. He tolerated his boss's relationships with various women, including Susan. But when Ray announced his engagement to Heather, It was the last straw. "I tried to help him," Lewis said through tears. "When the business started losing money, I falsified the books so the banks would keep lending to him, all for his sake. And then there she was, a young nurse who only saw him as a wallet." When Heather found out about the financial problems, she called Louis, demanding an explanation. They met at a motel where Louise tried to convince her not to leave Ray. "I thought I'd convinced her," Louise continued. "Then, on the day of the wedding, I found a note in her purse. She was going to blackmail Ray, threatening to tell everyone about his financial fraud if he didn't sign over one of the stores to her. Louis couldn't let that happen. After the banquet, he took the spare keys from Ray's office and drove to his house. Heather was surprised to see him, but let him in. "I just wanted to talk to her," Louis sobbed, "to convince her not to do it. Said she'd ruin Ray, and he was already on edge. But she laughed in my face. Said I was pathetic, that everyone knew how I felt about Ray, that I was just his chain dog. In a rage, he grabbed the first thing he could get his hands on, a letter opener. He didn't mean to kill me, he just wanted to scare me. But Heather kept taunting him, and he lost control. I saw the blood and panicked," Louis whispered. "I tried to cover my tracks, broke the window to make it look like a break-in. I didn't realize Susan had come in too. She must have come in right after I did." Morrison put a stop to the report. The case was solved, a murder out of jealousy, but not the one everyone thought. A week after Luis Garcia's arrest, life in River Bend began to return to normal. Morrison stood at the window of his office, watching the last of the snow melt. Spring was coming, bringing with it the hope of a new beginning. Susan Norton had decided to leave town. After everyone found out about her relationship with Ray, it had become impossible to stay in River Bend. She transferred to a hospital in a neighboring state, determined to start her life with a clean slate. Vic Donovan entered treatment for gambling addiction. His sister's death was a sobering blow. With the money he received from Ray, he paid off his debts and vowed never to gamble again. Ray Lewis sold 2 of his 3 stores to cover his debts. He also put the house where the murder took place up for sale, unable to be in the place where his wife died. People said he had given up a lot and hardly ever left his apartment above his remaining store. Luis Garcia was awaiting trial in the county jail. He was facing life in prison, but his attorney hoped for a reduced sentence because of his state of mind. Sheriff Morrison closed the case file and put it back on the shelf. Another tragedy, another puzzle pieced together from the shards of human passions. In a small town where everyone knows each other, secrets have a particularly destructive power. He stepped outside, breathing in the fresh spring air. Life went on, but the memory of the young bride whose life had been cut short on what should have been the happiest day would long haunt the people of River Bend, Sheriff Clyde Morrison included.